The process whereby a victim of trauma takes control of the narrative, takes power, is a long and arduous one that eludes many people. And studies of post-traumatic stress demonstrate this. Even more than post-traumatic stress, developmental trauma, such as what young Frederick Douglass experiences, is indelible, impacting the body, mind, and spirit of those facing it. Trauma is deeply seated, and I want to show you Bessel van der Kolk's "The Body Keeps the Score," the emphasis he places on trauma changing the way the brain functions. And in front of you is a quote from "The Body Keeps the Score." As part of a study of war veterans, we gave our participants a Rorschach test. Unlike tests that require answers to straightforward questions, responses to the Rorschach are almost impossible to fake. The Rorschach tests also taught us that traumatized people look at the world in fundamentally different ways from other people. For most of us, a man coming down the street is just someone taking a walk. A rape victim, however, may see a person who is about to molest her and go into a panic. We all know this language of the trigger. In cases such as war veterans' post-traumatic stress, talking cures or pharmaceuticals, van der Kolk argues, are not enough to heal. His reference to the fear of a threat, the man coming down the street, calls to mind not only the rape victim, to which I will return one more time, but also to other forms of structural violence and trauma. Although he left Teju Cole's essay seemingly at peace with his filial connections to the past, latent signs of trauma become evident as his essay continues. Similar to Baldwin and Ta-Nehisi Coates, who in Between the World and Me describes the constant threat of violence that could, quote, cost me my body, end quote. Cole reminds the reader that even for him, a Black man in Baldwin's shadows who enjoys the Swiss spas with no sideways glances or racial epithets, the threat of violence and its potential impact are not far off. And here is a quote from later in the essay where he says, "The American police continued shooting unarmed Black men or killing them in other ways." The protests that followed in Black communities were countered with violence by a police force that is becoming indistinguishable from an invading army. People began to see a connection between the various events, the shootings, the fatal chokeholds, the stories of who was not given life-saving medication, and Black communities were flooded with outrage and grief. This is around the time of I believe it's around 2012. I'm realizing I didn't put the date of this essay and need to remind you of that date, and I'll get it. I think it's 2012, but I'm gonna remind myself and just make sure. The indelible imprint of the shootings of unarmed Black men, the martial experiences indistinguishable from an invading army, the shootings, fatal chokeholds linger in the body, all those miles from New York City to Switzerland. And these are part of how Cole sees Rembrandt and listens to Bach. The breaks, the tears are in the body and the brain. Trauma is kinesthetic. It will impact how we read a text, view a monument, or enter a building named after Confederate sympathizers, slaveholders, and eugenicists. This is true of all bodies, whether seemingly neutralized, racialized, or gendered. I'll end this section with a quote from Danny Bostic's essay on the classics called "Not for All," which makes the point so poignantly, and it is in front of you. Nostalgic retrieval of a highly stratified social order is safe for people who enjoy a dominant position in society, but threatening to those who do not. The nostalgic myth of the golden past requires the creation of a world where rape is romance and enslavement a benign work arrangement. Erasure of oppression is a feature of nostalgia that increases the esteem of the oppressor and robs the oppressed of voice, power, and identity. And I want to point you not only to Danny's 2020 essay, but anything she's done this year on Zoom. If you can get a recording, and also prior to COVID, she had a CAS panel, Classical Association of the Atlantic States, where she and her co-presenter discussed reading rape in, of course, such texts as Ovid's Metamorphoses. Well, let me wrap up and close by saying a few more things about power, promised in the title of my talk. To the question of what is to be done, the students who put forward 3 demands of the University of Richmond's administration demonstrate the kind of revision of power that Miranda Fricker puts forward in her book, Epistemic Injustice, Power and the Ethics of Knowing. Opposing Michel Foucault's idea that power exists only when it is put into action, Fricker parses power as capacity, belonging to social agents as well. In this context, she writes, quote, "There are operations of power which are dependent upon agents having shared conceptions of social identity," end quote. Such is the power of demonstrators and student protesters who join as a demos to assert their agency, notwithstanding the presence of structural relational power opposing them. Power begins in the body as well, like that of the survivor of trauma, who seeks to dominate the trauma that controls our bodies. The building, the heritage, is the classical, but bodies inhabit these. And as van der Kolk knows, the body keeps the score. We do not know how things will unfold at the University of Richmond. The students are threatening to disaffiliate with the university in the coming days if their demands are not met. While I might have been baffled or even annoyed by the students' use of the word demands, I've come to understand them in terms of what Ferguson calls an epistemic shift, an epistemological shift. This shift is about the activation of the perhaps latent power that resides in every individual. And I hope to have demonstrated how we might grapple with such an epistemological shift within the professional field of classical studies. Thank you for listening.